Okay.
Hi, I'm Celine Coggins, Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education, and I want to welcome everyone to our ever-growing group of OST funders. I'm going to turn things over to Kathleen, but I'm really excited to see how this group is growing, and I love these meetings because I get to learn so much. Take it away,
Great.
Kathleen.
Okay. So I think it's just, okay, so we're just about 2 minutes in. I think people are probably still coming on. But as usual, we have a lot to talk about and not that many minutes that we have in front of us to use. So I think I'll get started with some intro things before I introduce Nat. So thanks, first of all, for giving us an hour on Friday afternoon before Memorial Day. It's going to be kind of a weird long weekend, but I hope you have some interesting and joyous things planned, however you define that. And one thing I wanted to put in the chat, let me just grab my link, because I have put together a number of resources for the out of school time funder community. And these actually are of interest to folks who are funding across sector as well. But I'm going to throw this right now in the chat, and then we will send this also to folks after. But if you want to take a look at that at your leisure, there are resources in there about recent activities that After School Alliance, just kicking off a week of promoting summer and after school programs as key to restart and recovery, a lot of events there. National After School Association, which has been holding web seminars and video chats with practitioners and program leaders, and digging into a lot of the immediate challenges that people face. And then we have Every Hour Counts that is planning a national webinar on June 4th that is going to highlight the role of citywide intermediaries and the work that they're doing with some really interesting breakout sessions. So a lot going on. And you'll see a list of events there and some resources as well. National After School Association has put out a scenario planning tool that you may want to share with your grantees, looking at all of the different things that may happen or may not happen around opening, and the questions that people need to be asking themselves and things that people need to be aware of as they plan. So I also made that chat editable. So share things that you know of that are not in there. And we can continue as a community to keep each other informed as we go. I also wanted to mention that we usually do these things bi-weekly, but we've got a couple of other things coming up for GFE. So our next one will be on June 19th. And we're going to welcome the leaders of the readiness projects. And so I'll talk a little bit about that right when we close. So right now I'm going to introduce Nat Kendall-Taylor, and I'm super excited that he has an hour to share with us because you're a very busy person. He has a lot to share and teach us around how to talk about COVID right now, how to talk about teenagers, how to talk about the essential role of nonprofits. One of the reasons why I asked Nat to spend an hour with us is because a couple of weeks ago, I asked you all to do a survey about what you'd like to talk about during these calls. And the idea that out of school time is all the time now. And as we move forward, the line between what's in school and what's out of school is likely to be reimagined. And that idea of how to leverage this moment and capitalize on it to help us advance a narrative that really gets taken up by mindsets across all of the different stakeholder communities, that learning is everywhere. So how can we as a after school, out of school time community take advantage of this moment? That came up really high in the survey that you all wanted to talk about. So I thought Nat would be perfect to help us think about that. And we can take whatever themes come out of this conversation and think about what conversations we want to have following. So I'm going to kick it over to Nat now. And as usual, please use the chat for your questions and comments throughout, because we'll be stopping and talking about your questions and comments at several points throughout this. So thanks again, Nat, CEO of Frameworks, for spending some time with us.
No problem, and thank you very much. Just a quick check, Kathleen, Celine, I can see both of you. Can you give me a thumbs up? Can you hear me okay? All right, great. So I just want to, first of all, say hello, and I hope everyone's doing okay and hanging in there. It is Friday, I think, even though kind of always perpetually feels like it's Wednesday at 10:30 for me. That's kind of that's my new normal. And just to tell you that I'm really excited to get to spend an hour with you talking about framing. It is pretty much my all-time very favorite thing to do, which I realize is kind of sad and pathetic, but framing does feel particularly salient and important in the moment that we are in right now, where clearly the way that we are talking about our issues and positioning our ideas is incredibly important and of great consequence. So just two quick thank yous. First of all, thank you to Celine and Kathleen for inviting me to be on. It's really cool to get to share some of the stuff that I've been thinking about for the last 3 months with you all. So thank you very much. And then as Kathleen said as Kathleen and Celine said at the top, thank you all for making the tough decision to spend an hour of your Friday before the holiday weekend on a webinar. I will do my best to make it worth your time and to try to give you something valuable that you can take right out of this call and apply to the work that hopefully you do, not later on today, but maybe next week on Tuesday. And that really is my one and only one goal for our time here today. It's to be helpful. I hope I can take the work that we do on framing at Frameworks, the work that I've done for the last 13, 14 years of my life at the organization, and bring it to you all in a way that is helpful, the ways that kind of adds to your repertoire of tools that you use to do the work that you're doing. And I kind of the motivation to be helpful is normally what drives me in my work, but I would just say that over the last 2 to 3 months, it's kind of as my motivation, it's been turned all the way up to 11. So I hope I can be helpful to you all here today. Just a little bit more about me, not because I think you care or that you should care, but rather that it's actually kind of important to the work that I'm going to be talking about. I am not someone who's trained in communications or has worked in PR. I'm a cognitive or psychological anthropologist by training. And what that means is that I study the way that culture influences how people think, how people use culture to process information, to make meaning of messages, and importantly, to formulate and make decisions. And I do that work with about 30 other framing geeks and dweebs at Frameworks who are not just anthropologists, but people who are sociologists and political scientists and linguists, and have been doing a lot of thinking. Kind of, we always think about framing, but that thinking has kind of been put onto overdrive in the last 3 months, where, as I said, the way that we communicate is clearly of great consequence. So what we're going to do here today, as Kathleen said, is I'm going to take you through a couple of blocks of more kind of content presentation. We'll have some points during that where we stop and I take some questions, which Kathleen is going to help me do, from you all, and we'll get to the end, and hopefully it will have been helpful and great, and you will have decided it was a good way to spend a little bit of your time on Friday. So I want to start by resetting. I want to start by resetting our understanding of framing so that we're kind of all on the same level going into this conversation. Framing is one of these words that, like narrative change, has become so ubiquitously used that I'm afraid it has lost any and all meaning it ever once had. So we're gonna start with a really basic definition of framing that I hope is helpful. So when we talk about framing for the next 49 minutes, what we mean is the choices that we make and how we present information. So those can be really small, seemingly inconsequential choices. The pronouns that we use, for example, do we say us and them, or do we say we? The verbs that we choose and how those verbs imply agency of groups or deny and take away that agency, as well as the big obvious things like the values that we endorse to argue for why our issues and reforming them and changing them is so important. Each of those choices are framing choices, and framing is about the way that those choices affect how people think, how they feel, and how they act. So that's framing, plain and simple. Choices we make in how we present information and how those choices influence what people do as a result, how they think, how they feel, and what they are or are not willing to do as a result. One of the examples that I like to give, which is a very clear illustration of this principle and the power of it, comes from some work in the early 2000s by two social psychologists who ran an experiment in which they got a nationally representative sample of Americans. They divided them into two groups. The first group was given the message that you see on the screen right now, given the importance of free speech. Would you favor allowing hate group to hold a political rally? The other half got the same message, except you can see in bold here, the frame, the lens that people are given to approach this question or this issue is different. So instead of free speech and its importance, the second group got a frame that kind of reminds them or primes them to think about the risk of violence. Then everybody, regardless of which message they got, is asked to indicate whether or not they'd be supportive of allowing this group to hold this political activity. Those who were primed with free speech were largely endorsive. 85% of this really large sample said that they would be in favor. And when you flip the frame, when you change the lens through which people come to the issue, you see support dramatically reduce, right? So really simple, clear, I think kind of elegant example of the way in which we present information has consequences in terms of whether people are or not willing to do the things that we would want them to consider the things that we would want them to. So I work a lot and study metaphors in great detail, and I've come to, this is really recently, like in the past month, I've come to think about framing through the metaphor of a key and unlocking. So the way that we present our issues really does have the power to unlock and create space for people to come into our conversations and have kind of engaged and legitimate discussion, to move and shift mindsets, or, and this is frequently the case, and we're seeing this a lot these days, the way that we, maybe without knowing it, are positioning our issues also has the ability to lock up that space, to close down those conversations, and to kind of keep people from coming in and having discussions and considering solutions and actions that are necessary to address social issues. So we're going to be talking more about this key and the power of framing in the moment right now to unlock some of the kind of conversations and thinking that we're trying to advance. So you all know this. This is, and I guess this is kind of a common theme of the whole presentation. I'm probably going to tell you a lot of things that you know. They're kind of there in the back of our minds, and part of my job is just to kind of pull them to the front of our minds and engage them all together. But you all know, I think, that the way that issues are being framed right now in this moment matters a great deal. I have been kind of keeping track of and collecting these really interesting frames that we're seeing, and some of these are almost commonsensical to the point where they're cliches now. But just to give you a few examples of the kind of things that I've been noticing. So first of all, the kind of very obvious one, which is kind of fading out of discourse, but was quite prevalent early on in the pandemic, was this frame of Chinese virus, of referring to the pandemic as the Chinese virus. And there's been lots of commentary and good work that shows that framing does things, right? It's not an inconsequential use of two words, but instead it activates a very strong fear of other. It creates kind of this insular nationalistic sense, and it creates really powerful, palpable senses of racism, most immediately against individuals of Asian descent, but also, I think, in some really unfortunate ways, kind of seeps and spills over into the way that we think about other groups that comprise our society. Another one of my kind of morbid favorites is the draconian measures frame, which is still being used and is kind of finding its way back into the discussion of mask, no mask that we're seeing kind of so prevalent in the discourse right now. But what that does really powerfully is it establishes a sense, if the measures that are being recommended are draconian, then they're seen immediately as an overreaction, and that people become very resistant to the information that is framed as being draconian, and thus very hesitant to act on that information. And then last but not least, and this one is a little bit more subtle, but I think really important to the work that you all do, another message that we've been seeing a lot of is around these kind of vulnerability or saviors, saints kind of messages around protecting the vulnerable. And there's a ton of good work, some of which I'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation, that shows that while obviously these messages in most cases I think are are advanced with the best intentions in mind, they have these really unfortunate backfire effects where they instantly other those groups that we've labeled as vulnerable. They create a zero-sum thinking in which more for those vulnerable groups by definition means less for me and mine. And I think really powerfully, not only do they create stigma in terms of how we think about other groups, but they also create this interesting phenomenon of self-stigma, where people who are being labeled as being vulnerable, it has been shown, whether that's older people or communities of color, actually view their own group in a less valuable and more stigmatized way. So some really clear ways that framing matters right now, but also to make the point that it doesn't just matter right now. Framing has mattered for a very long time. And I've picked an example that shows you this from some of our work that we've done on framing early childhood issues, which is a big part of our portfolio of work, where we've worked with an organization at Harvard University called the Center on the Developing Child, which as its mission is trying to translate the science of early childhood development for people who are in positions to formulate policy and practice. And they've been really struggling for a long time to communicate effectively about the idea of child mental health, that young children can even have mental health, and that we as a society should be supportive of policies designed to support that mental health. And so in this experiment, we tested two different values frames, which you see along the horizontal axis of the graph here, to try to see if we could come up with ways of making people more supportive of the kind of solutions that evidence and science point at would be effective in improving early childhood development and child mental health in particular. So this experiment was conducted with about 6,000 people selected to be nationally representative. And the way that it works is each of those 6,000 people is randomly assigned to read about a child mental health program. So those assigned to the first group read about that child mental health program, but they're primed, or the first sentence or two about that program is kind of doses or contains this value of future progress and social prosperity. So people who were assigned to that message would read something that begins like, it's important that we do a better job of supporting early childhood development and mental health because, we wouldn't say it in this way, don't worry, children are our future, right? Their stability, their positive mental health, their healthy development determines our ability in the future as a country to be successful, prosperous, and work well. Those people randomly assigned to the second group read the same program. So it's the same 80 words, except the first 10 to 15 are different. So instead of future progress, social prosperity, they would read something like, it's really important that we do a better job of addressing early childhood development, child mental health, because children are our most vulnerable citizens. They deserve our empathy and our compassion, and we must do better by them. And then everybody answers the same set of questions that are designed to measure how supportive they are of this set of, in this case, I think it was 12 evidence-based policies and practices. And so what you get when you run the analysis is you get a look at how being exposed to those different frames affects how supportive people are of those policies. So when you run the analysis, you get these, what I think are two absolutely gorgeous green bars. And what they show you is two things. So first of all, being exposed to this program through the value of future progress and social prosperity makes people more supportive of the policies to a statistically significant degree. That's the good news. There's a little framing dance that we do when we get results like that, but this is a webinar and I'm not going to do that. The less good news is towards the right-hand side of the screen, where you see, obviously, this value of vulnerability is having not only an effect which is statistically indistinguishable from zero, which is no message, but instead is making people less supportive of those policies. So I'll translate that for you and emphasize it for a second. If you are an expert or an advocate working on early childhood development, child mental health, you frame your issue through the value of vulnerability. You not only waste your words and your valuable communications real estate, but you use that valuable real estate in a way that directly disadvantages the goals that you have as a researcher, professional, practitioner, advocate on this issue. And so the really interesting thing is that in a subsequent piece of analysis, we looked at all the field's external facing materials over a 3-year period. So all of the press releases, websites, mission statements, pamphlets, everything that people who were working on child mental health were putting out. And guess which value we found was endorsed, was primed in over 90% of those communications. So normally you have a chance to answer that, but this is a rhetorical question because it's a webinar. That is the value of vulnerability. So what in essence the field have been doing for a really long time, and I've chosen this example deliberately because I think it is going on the issues that you all work on right now, is advancing a value that obviously they thought would work and had good intentions behind, but in actuality worked directly against the goals that they had as a field. So I want to just pause here for a second, and this is where we can take some initial questions. I have a prime, something that I would be really interested in hearing you all talk about, which is something, as I said, that I'm a collector of and I'm always on the lookout for, which is kind of what are some important examples of issue framing that you all have seen over the last 2-3 months, kind of during the pandemic. So I'd love to hear you type in some answers to that question. I'm also willing to take some initial questions that you may have about the very first bit of content that we've done here. And I think Kathleen is going to help me kind of curate or read some of those things, because unfortunately when I'm in presenter mode, I have trouble seeing the chat.
Yeah, that's great. And we do have a few questions about the what you just showed us around the vulnerability versus social prosperity.
Let's do it.
One is, which is mine, do you think that extends to older children and adolescents? Even if you didn't do that specific study, would you say that that's not just about early childhood?
Yeah. So this is, I'm going to talk about this later. I'll just kind of preview it a little bit. So we've done a lot of work, not on early childhood. We've done a lot of work on education. We've done a lot of work on out of school time as well, on older, not young children, but older youth as well as issues on, research on like 40 different issues. And it is a consistent finding, not just in our research, but in the research of other people who do work on framing, that vulnerability frames are incredibly problematic as a way to talk about groups of people and ideas and issues related to groups of people. There's a fantastic organization that I am a major fan of called the Perception Institute, who has some new work that's just coming out some that exists on their website already, but some new work coming out around the effect of vulnerability frames. But it is clearly a consistent finding across issues and across periods of the cycle of human development. We have done work, for example, on aging and older adults, which shows the same thing even more powerfully than it does in the green bars that I just showed you, that when older adults are framed through the value or through the frame of vulnerability, which I will just remind you of is going on with a high degree of intensity right now, there are these same effects.
And one question as a follow-up on this subject is, can you elaborate on how the vulnerability frame primes zero-sum thinking?
Yeah, so and again, I'll talk about this later, which means I'll just get to go over it faster later, so that's great, is that anytime you create a sense that this group is over here and is vulnerable and is different than my group, you've set up this way that I would argue, kind of as a human species, have for drawing lines between an us and a them. And so we never want to see ourselves as vulnerable. So as soon as you've made a group vulnerable, you've kind of given people permission to distance and otherize this group and distance themselves from it. And as soon as that's set up in contexts that involve resources, systems, and policies, you've created zero-sum thinking, whereby if we're doing anything to help those vulnerable people over there, and I'm using these pronouns intentionally here, then by definition, and I'm not part of that group because I'm not vulnerable, by definition, you are taking resources away from, or you are diminishing the resources that my group has access to.
Okay, great. I'm gonna, so people have answered your question. Do you want me to just throw a bunch
just
of
read a
stuff at you?
couple. I'd love it, yeah.
Okay, all right. So same boat versus same storm. Framing the pandemic as a focus on public health or the economy. A new frame around the value of teachers. Many now saying they realize how important teachers are now, So looking for your thoughts on this, also about the frame that childcare is the backbone of the economy. And also framing around jobs as either essential or non-essential. And how can we leverage this so that youth development jobs are actually seen as essential? And keep all this coming in the chat as well. Thank you for those of you who have already contributed.
Yeah, thank you very much. And I didn't ask you this before, Kathleen, but if I could get those, if I could get a copy of the chat, that would be great, because even the 5 that you said that I wrote down are the really important frames, and they have, I would argue, are having a considerable effect on public thinking. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is how these kind of frames of the moment are actually going to have long-term effects in terms of where we're able to go or not able to go in terms of our issues.
Yeah, we will share that with everybody.
Yeah, I would love that. I'm working on a piece on public health right now that really dives into that second one that you said, which is this binary or zero-sum way that health and the economy are being framed, and how kind of deep and persistent that framing is in our discourse. The ways that health and economy are normally kind of divided by "or" is the normal word that comes in between health. It's health or the economy, and the kind of pervasiveness and persistent nature of that frame, I think, is really powerful. And I am of the camp that thinks the way that we're talking about issues right now will have a significant influence on what kind of change is available or unavailable going forward. That these frames we're using right now they're like super big keys that are either opening things or locking them up. So thank you very much. I'm going to continue if that's okay, Kathleen. Yeah? Okay. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the time, and we'll have one more break in between here where we'll take a couple more questions, is I'm going to go through pretty quickly 4 of the kind of big ideas that I've been thinking about over the last, I used to say 2 months, but it's more than 2 months now, in terms of how we frame our issues. And I'm going to try to do this with reference to areas of work that we have at Frameworks that are hopefully pretty directly relevant to the way that to the work that you're doing, whether that's on out of school time learning, or kind of how we talk about and engage young people. So I'm going to try to big ideas, and I'm going to try to put them down into examples that are directly relevant for things you're doing. And so the first thing that I've been thinking about a lot, and I would say this is like from day one, this is an idea that has really caught my interest, and I think is hugely important in this kind of now and later perspective. But it's the importance of how we're talking about kind of how we're framing individuals and individual responsibility, and government responsibility. And we've seen a number of different ways that kind of individuals and government are being framed. And I'm going to walk you through just a couple of those and kind of what I think they're doing. And this, obviously, the framing that you see on the left-hand side of the screen certainly predates the pandemic. But anytime that government is framed as being broken, inept, corrupt, incapable, nefarious, kind of all of these ways that we've become very comfortable talking about government, you've kind of seen an exponential increase in these. The result is that we let government off the hook. We become focused on the role that individuals have. We become very prone to seeing the value of kind of, running it like a business and privatizing areas that are currently, and I would argue, should be government responsibility. And if government, given its responsibilities, can't do anything, there's a sense of fatalism, a really powerful sense of fatalism that we get, where we start to think that kind of nothing can be done, and we disengage from issues. Another really interesting, and this one is problematic, I want to make sure that I'm being heard right on this one, is all of this focus on the heroic actions of individuals, primarily within clinical and healthcare settings, but also from kind of a charitable perspective. And while actions of individuals are certainly important and are a big part of what's going on, my argument is that a myopic focus on individual actions and acts of kind of heroic actions really powerfully obscure the role of government. They play so strongly into our senses of individualism that we basically forget about government and its responsibilities, and we let government off the hook, and we hold individuals, particularly those individuals who are in groups that are severely affected by the current situation, more and more responsible for the situation and for the outcomes. So there's also a sense in which we've kind of, from a more positive perspective, we've seen a lot of this framing, and this is the stuff that really kind of makes me excited, that I think, I hope we don't let our foot off the gas on. A sense that we hold government responsible. We emphasize the unique and necessary role that only government can play. And we hold them accountable for when that role is not being fulfilled, when those functions are not being kind of carried out. And we've seen in our work, and other people have seen, that when you're able to advance that kind of frame for talking about government, you temper or you balance people's senses of individual responsibility in productive ways. And you make people demand action from the government in some really powerful ways. So again, kind of two unproductive ways of framing this conversation, and one that I think is much more productive. So the recommendations for how to have this conversation that we're making, and that we're seeing, by the way, that we're seeing people do. I want to be clear that in all of these recommendations, I'm not saying that these are not things that people are already doing. They certainly are, and there's some wonderful examples of this. But it's to make really clear and repeated calls for increased government action, and to evoke a strong sense that government is responsible. To not only throw those out there, but to explain the unique role that government and only government can play in some of these situations that we are in right now, and actions that need to be advanced. To be really specific about what needs to happen, but I think, on the other hand, also to be really specific about what hasn't happened, and to evoke a strong sense of accountability in this government discourse. And now a way of kind of tempering the kind of fatalism, government is broken, inept, corrupt discussion is to advance a sense that government can do these things, but that it needs to be held accountable for performing these actions. So we do want to give people a sense of efficacy here, that this is possible, that government can do these things. And then I think really importantly, kind of put this on repeat, put it on spin cycle, because people are being exposed to an inordinate repetition of the individualistic kind of hero individualism frames. And the only way to balance that is with an equally persistent and consistent focus on particular ways of talking about government and individual responsibility. The second idea, and again, this is not one that's unique or new in COVID, but I think has some interesting dimensions, and I think is really important on the issues that you all are working on, is that we know the data are important. So I'm not going to stand up here, sit up here in front of you and tell you all who work a lot with data that those data don't matter. But I am going to say that they're not all that matters. That data by themselves are frequently really unproductive and sometimes counterproductive, but that with context, data can do the things that we want them to, and that we think that they can do. So I think the primary way that you see this right now are these kinds of advancements of what I would call kind of naked data about COVID disparities, just kind of putting out the differential ways that groups of color have been affected in terms of rates of infection and mortality, or the differential ways that communities of color are being affected by the suspension of formal education. And I think that without context, kind of just advancing those data and only the data, the facts and nothing but the facts, the effect is, first of all, and I think most importantly, the second one that you see on the right-hand side of the screen, is that people are highly adept at reinterpreting those data and kind of making those data fit the stereotypes that they have of particular groups of people. So when we advance data that show disparities, one effect is that those data are actually used as evidence cognitively in people's minds to reinforce the unproductive, and I would argue kind of ugly stereotypes that we have for certain groups of people. And I'll talk about this more in a second. On the other hand, we've seen that when you're able to contextualize data, explain what it means, give people a way to understand it, use values to frame it, people are able to use those data to see the point you're trying to make, and can really powerfully connect with it. So I am without any shame, I have a total intellectual academic crush on a social scientist social psychologist out of Stanford University called Jennifer Eberhardt. I don't know if people are familiar with her work, but she does a lot of work on kind of framing and race, particularly in criminal justice sectors, but she's done work on school discipline and kind of other ways, kind of other punitive systems and framing. And one experiment, I think this was a 2014 experiment, if I'm right, she runs a lot of experiments. She tested different messages about criminal justice that included kind of these relatively, as I call them, kind of naked or bald data about racial disparities, about Black men in this case, and tested kind of the same messages without those stats about Black men. And there was and you can tell where this is going based on the way that I've set this up, but what to most people was this kind of really mysterious result, which was those messages that were framed with these relatively bald kind of racial disparities statistics actually made people more supportive of punitive measures. So this work was done in California, and it was done in New York. And in California, these messages with the stats led to dramatic increases in the endorsement of 3 strikes you're out policies. And in New York, they led to dramatically higher support for stop and frisk measures. And so there's this great quote from Eberhardt and her co-author, who gets less love, so I put her name here as well, that kind of distills what's going on in a really powerful way. So they say that stripped of context, standalone statistics may simply be used as evidence of the stereotype that Blacks are prone to criminality. So really important in terms of how we think about using our data. We've got a similar example of this from some work that we've done in the United States on criminal justice, where when we presented people with facts about racial disparities without context, they attributed responsibility to individuals, and their support for addressing disparities through policies decreased. When we took those same data and we framed them with a value, kind of a common sense pragmatism value, those facts became incredibly powerful in the opposite direction of increasing people's sense of systemic responsibility and increasing their support across the board, irrespective of political ideology, of addressing those disparities through policies. So the what to do's here are values can be really powerful. So values are statements that we make about why an issue matters. So fairness, collective prosperity, on the negative side, vulnerability, can be really helpful in giving our data that grip and context, and helping people connect them to why an issue matters. Being really clear, I think this is something really commonsensical that we don't do enough, is to be really clear and prescriptive about what it is our data mean and why we are using them, what point we are using them to make. And then think about using data to show something other than the extent of a problem. I think that's a really interesting one. When you look at the way that people working on social issues tend to use data, is overwhelmingly as evidence of the problem, and almost never is it used as evidence that there is a solution that might work. And so I think we can think about some other ways of using data to illustrate kind of efficacious solutions and not just crisis problems. I'm gonna stop here again, Kathleen, to see if there's any more questions that have come in, and then I just have a couple more quick points that I'll make, and then we'll wind it up.
Great. And so folks, again, you can write questions in the chat. If you'd like to, you can unmute yourself and ask a question too. So just go ahead and do that if you want. Can you go back to that last slide, Nat?
Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you about the last thing that's on that slide, about thinking about how to use data to show something other than the extent of the problem. Can you provide an example of that you think works?
Certainly. So I'll kind of stay in criminal justice because those are the examples that I was using, but this applies. We've done work on school discipline that applies to that, and other issues as well. So in the kind of school discipline discourse, there's lots of data that shows that the extent to which normally young men of color are punitively dealt with by the system is dramatically higher than any other group, right? So that's an example of data being used to illustrate the problem. There's also data that shows the power of interventions to remediate that effect, right? So if X, Y, and Z are done, we see fewer young men of color being involved in disciplinary action. So that there's data about that as well. There's data about those interventions and solutions, and those are really powerful in giving people a sense that there's something, this isn't just an intractable, systemic, or natural problem, but rather it is something by doing things in different ways that can be addressed. And I think that anytime you're talking about issues that are, and I'll talk about this in a second, about race and equity or systemic racism, being able to show the power of solutions and not just emphasize the problem are incredibly powerful and important.
So there's one question around learning loss, the idea of learning loss. I'm going to add a little bit to that, like also achievement gap, which is something that I think people throw around. Sometimes you hear opportunity gap. What do you think about the ways, especially right now, people are talking about learning loss, and who is most impacted by learning loss? What do you think about that frame, and how do we, as most of the people here, funders of summer programs, youth development, out of school time programs that are constantly being, charged with reduce learning loss, prevent learning loss, close achievement gaps. How should we talk about that?
Yeah. So I apologize that I keep doing that, but I think that some of reason number 3 and 4 will help to answer that question. Some of it is about the importance of advancing kind of affirmative visions and not responding to frames that we think are more problematic. So that I think there really is a moment right now for the work that you all do on informal or out of school time to really advance the affirmative vision of the power of those opportunities and those spaces and those times, rather than trying to be responsive to things like learning loss or achievement gap. So and this is again a very a very solid consensus finding in communications, that where there are these frames that are unproductive for the points that we're making, that the worst thing we can do is to repeat them in refuting them. Right. So every time you repeat something, you give it air, you give it breath, you exercise that idea. So if people are really well trained in thinking about learning loss, you repeating learning loss in order to debunk it is actually making the problem worse. Right. It's why myth fact constructions are so problematic in the way that we talk about social issues. So I guess my answer to that, and I realize this may not be a completely satisfactory answer, is to really focus more on the kind of frames that you're trying to advance and getting those really right and being powerful on those, rather than trying to kind of debunk and speak to these ideas that you think are less productive. I won't get into the achievement gap one. We've actually written some about that. I can make some things available. I have major problems with that one, as I think a lot of people are beginning to have, and it goes back to some of that us versus them thinking, some of that fatalism, some of those same problems that that vulnerability has, both in terms of the way that we think about other groups and then the way that other groups are conditioned to think about themselves as a result of some of this discourse.
Okay, great. We have a couple of kind of ways to go about the framing questions. So one is, what advice do you have for journalists who may be hesitant to express quote unquote values when presenting data? Do you have any good examples of reporters who do this well?
Yeah, so we're involved in a project. So there's a bunch of things to say here. So first of all, I think framing for journalists, kind of introducing the idea to journalists. Journalists are some of the most challenging folks to get to think about framing, in part because their professional practice is predicated on this idea of kind of impartiality and balance. But I would argue back to that even those journalists who don't think that they are framing are framing. There's no such thing as an unframed argument or piece. We're involved with a project right now in the UK. It's an anti-poverty project in which the we've done a bunch of research, we've come up with a framing strategy, and one of the foundation who we've been working with, one of their mobilization strategies is kind of a journalist working group. So they've convened a group of journalists who report on poverty and the economy, and they've kind of slowly brought them along as the research was going, and are convening them to help them think, not to kind of force feed them with the frames, but to help them think about how, given the limitations of the venues and what they have to do, how they could employ those strategies in their work. So it might be the case that really kind of stridently evoking values is really inappropriate in journalism. It's much more appropriate for advocacy, but there certainly are other strategies. There are strategies other than values that journalists can use to productively frame ideas, whether that's to increase people's understanding of those ideas or to allow for a kind of more open discussion of ideas. So it can be done, it has been done, but I think it's challenging.
Okay, we've got another question, which is around research. So do you know of good ways to test different frames on issues without engaging in long-term academic research?
Yeah, I don't know if I just muted myself. Okay, I did not.
No,
mute
you're
myself.
good.
I became scared that the Amazon person was going to be in my background. So we do kind of peer-reviewed caliber academic research, a lot of long, involved, exhausting research. But I'm also not a purist when it comes to research. I think kind of research is more of a sensibility than necessarily a practice. I think there are tons of ways of piloting messages and trying to observe their effects, which is basically what we try to do. We do that experimentally, we do that in focus groups and interviews and a lot of things, but convening people with whom you want to communicate and exposing them to the ideas that you are thinking will be effective in framing and observing what happens as a result, that's research. And that can be incredibly helpful, can be quick, and can be cheap. So I think that, what I advocate for is getting out of the idea that as issue experts, we know how to frame our issues. So if we can kind of crack that and problematize that as someone who works on out of school time, I know how to talk about out of school time to people who don't work on out of school time. Like we need to problematize that. And I think the answer is to try to learn about how people who are not us, who live, eat, sleep, and breathe 24/7 the issues that we do, respond to the ideas that we think will be effective. And there's a number of ways of doing that are not, 6-month research projects or however you want to characterize the depth that we go into.
Great. So another question I had for you, and just as a time check, we have about 5 more minutes. So if you want to get your question in, then either unmute yourself or private chat me, and I'll call on you. But I have a question that at least can bring us maybe a little bit more towards a wrap. But so since most of the folks on the call are in philanthropy somehow, can you talk a little bit about the unique kind of role and potential and responsibility for philanthropy to play a role here, and particularly around this moment, right? So we have a lot of framing problems in this moment, particularly all the ones that you talked about. And then I think some that we haven't talked about, like teenagers are, don't care about the community and are running around not social distancing, and a lot of negative stuff around adolescence, which a lot of folks on this call have a particular strategy that focuses on adolescence. So what can funders do, really, is the question.
So we're not going to get to my reasons 3 and 4, so I'll just kind of pull a couple of points from them back into this conversation. So one of the things that I was going to show is how it seems totally commonsensical, but how powerful it is for members of the general public to, instead of hearing kind of teenagers are, what an awful time. Let's grin and bear it. Let's close our eyes and hopefully we get through it without a young person being, ruined and corrupted. Instead of that, hearing positive stories and examples of young people particularly young people participating civically in activities that have a larger benefit, how much of a dramatic frame shift that creates in terms of how people think and what they're supportive of and the solutions that they can see. So we have a whole body of work on how to frame adolescent development, which is available on our site, and I think has a lot of interesting things that people would find powerful in their work. And maybe if there's another opportunity somewhere down the line, we could do a briefing on that body of research in and of itself. But kind of back to your general question, Kathleen, that you started with, the role of philanthropy. So I really think there's two fairly unique roles that philanthropy and only philanthropy can play in this work on framing. And so one is a kind of time discipline ability that I think is unique to philanthropy. So this work, whether we call it kind of narrative change or shifting mindsets or whatever we want to call it, is not short, single issue, single organization campaign work. It is long-term repeating of frames, of alternative frames. I mean, the only way to counteract the way that we largely think of kind of danger, crisis, and corruption of adolescents and young people is to give people an alternative narrative to that and repeat it over time, such that we start to kind of shift the cultural milieu that shapes those understandings. So one is kind of discipline and commitment to this kind of work over time. So that's one. Second, which is kind of more of an infrastructure idea, is that the best way to shift culture is all together, right? If we can create some coherence of our messages and assure that we are advancing the same ideas rather than telling 55 and a half different stories, that kind of amplification, moving issues forward together, is kind of the key or the secret to changing culture. So I think another role for philanthropy is to build that infrastructure and provide that support that brings what are currently kind of cacophonous voices together around a common set of frames and commits to advancing those over time. I think those are two. I mean, there's other ones, but when asked that question, I think those are the two: kind of discipline and the infrastructure that is necessary for amplification. I hope that's helpful. I don't know. That's probably big meta ideas, but I guess that's the big one, is that I think philanthropy is really important for doing that big meta level work.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's super helpful to think about. And I think what we don't have time to get into, but maybe is a challenge for everybody to think about, is like, what does that look like as a grant making strategy? And I know that the work around adolescent development and then the partnership with the National Academies, that is funded by a funder, collaborative, the Funders for Adolescent Science Translation, will let folks, I'll send out or put in my Google document links to all that work has been done over the past year, which is an enormous, powerful set of work, and those funders have committed. I think that's an example.
Can I just add one more thing to interrupt you really quick? There's also a specific resource that has come out of that work, kind of a separate toolkit, which is about communicating about adolescents and young people in the context of COVID. So that exists on our website. It's a kind of a short, really to the point resource that talks about particular frames to use in this time to advance issues around adolescence and adolescent development, and to keep these issues from sliding in the direction that unfortunately we're really seeing them slide with the frames that are bouncing around.
Great. So, and we'll make sure everybody has that. I know you've got, actually, you can go to the Frameworks website and sign up for your COVID series, right? And then you get an email every once and then. It's super helpful. So last question, and we can share, well, can you give me these slides after, and we'll make sure that people have those too, because people are super curious about your 3 and 4 points. Do you want to just throw that one up so people can read it, or does it need a lot of context?
I think it probably requires context. We can give the slides. They will make sense as slides.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, great. And then just to, last question is, do you have any reflection on this is a loaded question for those of us who have been in this conversation for a really long time. Do you have any reflections on the term out of school time?
Saving that one till the end, huh? I feel like
You
I need to know.
have 30 seconds.
I feel like I need to know what I'm wading into before I get into this. So we've done work on informal out of school time, and I think my problem with that term is it references school. So it sets up this duality of perspective between in and out. And when you allow people to enter into that, there's one that is always prioritized and wins, and one that is always devalued and loses. So the in-out school kind of thing allows people to enter into that model and encourages them to evaluate the worthiness of both of those options in a way that I think just advancing the idea that that you are trying to advance, rather than kind of making it a referent to the other thing, if that makes any sense, is probably going to be more effective. I would probably maybe just really unpopular. You all probably liked me before that last answer.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's not a conversation that probably everybody on this call have been in at one point or another. And I think it's a super great question to close on, because in this moment, right, like what we used to think was out of school and in school is not what we will think in the future or what it will be. So how, we still have to, just as a community, really think about this. And I think that really ties back to your answer about what funders can do, which is, convene and resource people to have conversations that then can produce a somewhat consensus about a vision moving forward, and then resource people to move that. And so I think that that's a challenge to this community that, we have before us. So I just want to thank you, Nat. This has been really, really enlightening. And we will share the slides and we'll share the chat. And also definitely go to the Frameworks website and sign up for the COVID series. I really love your guys' work, and I was so happy to spend some time digging into it. And I just wanted to let people know again that the next one of these video chats is going to be on June 19th, and we'll let you know about it, but same time, same place, and we're going to have folks from the readiness projects, so the Forum for Youth Investment, the National Urban League, American Institute for Research, and we're going to have Terry Farind do moderation of that call. We'll talk about, many of you already are familiar with and working on readiness projects, but we're going to do an update and also think about the importance of the vision of the readiness projects during this time. So have a great weekend and couple of weeks before we see you again. And thanks again for the time. And thanks again to Nat.
Thank you very much. And feel free to join us. We have 2 separate webinars over those other Fridays. So check them out. And
yes,
thanks so much.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's where we'll be. Okay, great. Thank everybody.